The winter of 872 AD does not announce itself gently. It arrives the way it always does in northern England, without warning, without apology, without the slightest concern for who is not ready. The River Trent does not ask permission before it freezes. The sky does not negotiate before it turns the color of a bruise for 16 hours a day. The cold does not distinguish between the Anglo-Saxon farmer huddled behind the walls of his village and the man standing watch on the riverbank, breath rising in white clouds, hand resting on the hilt of a weapon he has carried since he was old enough to carry anything at all. And yet, on this particular stretch of frozen river, near a place called Torksey, thousands of men are not hiding. They are sharpening iron. They are pulling clinch nails from worn timber and hammering them straight again. They are checking the seams of ships that have been dragged up onto the frozen bank, inspecting the oar ports, testing the rigging against the kind of weather that will come before spring does. They are playing board games in the firelight. They are repairing leather. They are arguing about tactics. They are, in every meaningful sense of the word, preparing, not enduring, not surviving, not waiting for warmth to return before they get back to the business of living. Their enemies are doing none of these things. King Burgred of Mercia is, in the diplomatic language of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, making peace, which is another way of saying he is paying tribute to men he cannot dislodge, men who have made themselves at home in his kingdom during the one season he was certain no army would dare to operate. He has walls. He has warriors. He has every structural advantage of a settled civilization defending its own land, and he cannot do a thing about the men on the river. Here is the question that most history books do not ask, not loudly enough anyway. We know the Vikings raided. We know they sailed longships. We know about the monasteries they burned and the kingdoms they shook and the rivers they turned into highways of disruption across 2 centuries of European history. But we almost never ask the question underneath all of that. We almost never ask what made any of it possible in the first place. Not the swords, not the ships, not the famous ferocity. The winter. This is not a story about how the Vikings survived the cold. It is a story about how they turned the cold into a competitive advantage so total, so systematic, and so deeply embedded in everything they were that it gave them capabilities no other civilization in medieval Europe could replicate. It is a story about a machine built from wool and timber and fermented fish and frozen rivers and 6-foot-thick walls of turf that ran for 300 years and, in running, reshaped the map of the known world. By the end of this, you will understand something that most accounts of Viking history quietly skip over. You will understand why the people who defined an age of exploration were not from the Mediterranean, where the weather was mild. They were from the place where winter lasted half the year and killed anyone who was not paying attention. They did not conquer the cold, they learned to use it. To understand what happened at Torksey, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the geography that built the people who were standing on that frozen river in the first place. Scandinavia, in the 8th century, is not a place that rewards carelessness. The coastline of Norway is carved into narrow inlets, fjords, where the sea reaches deep into mountain valleys and winter arrives early and stays late. The growing season in much of the region lasts perhaps 4 months. The rest of the year, the ground is frozen or wet or both, and the darkness that descends in November does not fully lift until March. In the far north, the sun disappears entirely for weeks, not dimly, entirely. You can travel for days through landscape where no sun has risen, where the only light comes from stars, and on the right nights, from the green fire of the aurora hanging above the mountains, like something the gods left burning. This is not metaphor. This is the physical environment that shaped every decision the Norse people made about how to build, what to eat, how to dress, how to move, and how to fight. The key thing to understand is this: Scandinavia does not punish weakness slowly, it punishes it fast. Get the insulation wrong in your house, you freeze. Run short on food stores in November, you starve before March. Go out in wet wool instead of treated wool on a bad day. Hypothermia can kill a healthy man in hours. The margin for error in the Norse world was narrow enough that every generation had to solve the same set of problems, and every generation that solved them passed the solutions forward, not in written manuals, not in formal schools, in the things they built, in the way they dressed their children, in the stories they told around the fire when the dark came down, and there was nothing to do but stay warm and remember. That knowledge, accumulated over hundreds of years, is what would eventually appear organized, mobile, and terrifyingly effective on the banks of the River Trent. But let's be precise about what was actually happening in Scandinavia in the 8th century, because it was not simply a story of hardy northern people doing what hardy northern people do. There were pressures, real, material, historical pressures, and they were converging. The first pressure was population. From roughly 700 AD onward, the Norse regions were experiencing growth that the available farmland could not easily absorb. The iron plough had improved agricultural yields, but the land itself had hard limits. In a region where arable soil was already scarce, more people meant harder choices about who got to stay and who had to go find something else. The second pressure came from the south. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was expanding not just militarily, but culturally and religiously, and that expansion was pressing against the southern boundaries of Scandinavian territory. The Saxons, pushed by the Franks, pushed back against others. The geopolitical pressure worked like water finding cracks. It moved everything. The third pressure was internal. The gradual consolidation of power in Norway under Harald Fairhair, a process historians still debate in its details, though the general pattern seems established, meant that warriors who had operated as independent powers were suddenly faced with a choice: submit to a central authority or leave. Many of them left, and they had skills, ships, and very little patience for being told what to do. These three pressures did not produce the Viking Age by themselves, but they created the conditions in which a particular kind of person, resourceful, mobile, organized, and extremely good at surviving in the cold, was pushed out into the wider world and incentivized to stay there. Now, here is where most popular history takes a wrong turn. The image most people carry of the Viking raider is a summer image. A longship appearing out of morning fog on a coastline, warriors splashing ashore, a monastery burning. And that image is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Because the question of how those raids were sustained, how those armies were supplied, how those warriors stayed effective year after year in foreign lands, that question points directly back to the winter and everything it demanded of the people who survived it. Consider what it actually means to keep an army in the field through an English winter. You are not in your own country. Your supply lines, back to Scandinavia, are cut off by weather and distance. You have thousands of men who need to eat, stay warm, maintain their equipment, and be ready to fight again in spring. The local population is hostile. There are no modern supply chains, no railroad, no telegraph, no way to call for reinforcements that will arrive in time to matter. For most medieval armies, this was simply impossible. The campaign season ended in autumn, and that was that. Armies went home, or they dispersed, or they died in the cold trying to hold what they had taken. The Vikings did not go home. This is not a small difference. This is the difference between a raiding culture and a conquest culture. And the reason they could stay was not luck, and it was not ferocity, and it was not some mystical northern toughness. It was a set of practical solutions to practical problems, solutions that had been developed, tested, and refined over generations in one of the harshest environments in Europe. Let us meet the people who carried those solutions with them. Not the kings, not the famous names, The people whose contributions to the Viking winter system left marks that we can still find in the archaeological record today. The craftsman in the camp, the man bending over a ship's plank at Torksey, pulling nails by firelight, checking the curve of the hull against memory. We do not know his name. The historical record does not preserve the names of ship's carpenters, but archaeologists excavating the Torksey site found something that tells us exactly what he was doing. Clinch nails. Nails used in the construction of clinker-built ships found on the frozen bank of a river in the middle of an English winter. Someone was fixing ships. Someone knew how. And the fact that there were nails to find means that when spring came, those ships floated. The woman in the longhouse, not at Torksey, but somewhere in Iceland or Norway, in a building sunk slightly into the earth, its walls packed with material that would not be outperformed by modern insulation until centuries had passed. She is weaving. The spindle hall she leaves behind will be found by archaeologists 1,000 years later at a site in Newfoundland, which means that wherever she was, part of her work eventually crossed the Atlantic. She is not decorating. She is manufacturing survival equipment, one thread at a time. The child in the village, 8 years old, maybe 9, building a snow fort with the other children, while the adults are busy with the endless logistics of keeping a community alive through winter. Centuries later, an archbishop named Olaus Magnus will write about this practice in enough detail to make it clear that it was not incidental. The children are not simply playing, they are rehearsing. They are learning to coordinate under pressure, to hold a position, to organize a defense, to launch a coordinated assault. 15 years from now, this child will stand in a shield wall. What he is learning today, in the snow, will be part of what keeps him alive. These three people, the craftsman, the weaver, the child, are not famous. History does not give us their names. But they represent the three pillars of something that history does not discuss often enough: the civilian infrastructure behind the Viking military machine. Every raid depended on it. Every overwintering camp depended on it. Every successful crossing of the North Atlantic depended on it, and all of it was built on the foundation of knowing how to survive a winter. Now let us take the machine apart. Let us look at how it actually worked, piece by piece, because understanding the mechanism is the only way to understand why it succeeded where everything else failed. The first component is the building. The Viking longhouse is one of the most underestimated engineering achievements in medieval European history. Not because it is elaborate, it is not. It is, by any modern standard, simple. But it is simple in exactly the right ways. And the rightness of those ways was worked out not by architects with drawing boards, but by generations of people who understood that if the building failed, everyone inside it died. The shape comes first. A Viking longhouse is long and narrow, sometimes 30 meters or more in length, but rarely more than 8 or 9 meters wide. This proportion is not aesthetic, it is thermodynamic. A long, narrow building has a lower ratio of surface area to interior volume than a square building of the same capacity, which means, in practical terms, that less heat escapes through the walls per unit of space being heated. The people who built these structures did not have the mathematics to describe this principle. They had something more reliable: centuries of observing which buildings stayed warm and which ones didn't. In the forested regions of southern Scandinavia, the walls were built from timber, but not a single layer of timber. A double layer, with the space between packed tightly with moss. The moss served as insulation, trapping air in its fibrous structure, blocking wind, slowing the transfer of heat from the warm interior to the cold outside. Archaeologists and experimental archaeologists who have tested reconstructed longhouses find that this double-wall construction performs comparably to some modern insulation materials at equivalent thickness. In Iceland and Greenland, where trees were scarce, but something else was abundantly available, the builders worked with turf. The walls at some Icelandic and Greenlandic sites were up to 2 meters thick. 2 meters of densely packed earth and vegetation, sitting against the cold like a mountain sits against the wind. The longhouse, excavated at Hrísbrú in Iceland's Mosfell Valley, dating to around 900 AD, shows these construction techniques in detail. The building was not just a shelter. It was a thermal system. At the center of every longhouse, running down the long axis, was the fire pit, the Langoldur in Old Norse. Not a hearth in a wall, as in a medieval castle, where much of the heat goes up the chimney. A long, open fire at the center of the floor, with smoke rising to a hole in the ridge of the roof. Inefficient by modern standards. Extraordinarily effective by the standards of what was available. The heat radiated outward in all directions, into the living space, into the sleeping benches along the walls, into the bodies of the people and animals sharing the space. The animals are important. The typical Viking longhouse, particularly in the North Atlantic settlements, housed livestock in a separate biosection under the same roof. A mature cow produces roughly the same amount of heat as a small wood-burning stove, continuously, around the clock, without consuming any additional fuel. 3 or 4 cows, several sheep, a few pigs. Together they generated significant thermal output through the coldest months of the year. The people who designed this arrangement may not have thought of it in those terms, but they knew what worked. The evidence from multiple excavated sites makes the arrangement clear. There is also some evidence fragmentary, contested among archaeologists, and worth treating with appropriate caution of heating stones placed under the floor at certain sites, creating a kind of radiant floor warming. This has not been confirmed widely enough to state as fact, but it is consistent with a culture that was constantly problem-solving around the same central question. How do you keep a building warm when the temperature outside is trying to kill you? The second component of the machine is the clothing. There is a persistent visual cliché about Viking warriors. Bare arms, thin leather vests, striding through snowdrifts, as though the laws of thermodynamics do not apply. This image comes almost entirely from films and television, and it is almost entirely wrong. The actual evidence from burial sites, from waterlogged deposits, from the extraordinary textile finds at Oseberg and Gokstad tells a very different story. The Oseberg burial, excavated in Norway in 1904, contained textiles of such quality and variety that they have occupied textile researchers for more than a century. What they show is a sophisticated, technically demanding production of wool cloth, not just for warmth, but specifically for the demands of a cold and wet environment. Tablet weaving, which was widely practiced across the Norse world, produced fabric with exceptional density and structural integrity. These were not blankets. These were engineered garments. Wool is the central material, and the reason is something that every Norse woman who ever watched a man stumble in from a blizzard, soaking wet and still alive, understood without needing to be taught. Wool insulates even when drenched. Cotton fails wet. Linen fails wet. Wool does not. A wool garment, saturated with water, still traps air against the skin, still slows the body's heat loss, still keeps a man functional in conditions that would kill him in lighter materials within hours. The Norse world did not have the science to explain why. They had something more reliable, the unbroken observation, passed mother to daughter across generations, that the right cloth was the difference between a husband who came home and one who did not. The layering system was critical. Archaeological and experimental evidence suggests that a Norse person going out into serious winter weather wore multiple layers, a lighter wool garment against the skin, a heavier outer tunic, and a cloak made from a heavier wool or from animal hide, sometimes treated with animal fat to add water resistance. This is not fundamentally different from the layering system that modern outdoor clothing manufacturers sell as innovation. It is the same principle, arrived at through a different process. Not research and development, but survival pressure applied over centuries. And the people who made these garments, the weavers in the longhouses, the women whose spindle whorls have been found from Norway to Newfoundland, were not hobbyists. They were industrial producers working against a seasonal deadline. Every garment produced before winter was a piece of equipment that had to function, or someone suffered the consequences. The skills required were technical, the standards were rigorous, and the output was the difference between a fighting force that arrived at the spring campaign in good condition and one that did not. The third component is food. Modern military logistics treats food supply as a solved problem. For a medieval army operating in a hostile country through a northern winter, it was anything but. And the way the Norse world handled it reveals something important about how the whole system was organized. The preparation for winter did not begin in winter. It began in late summer, sometimes earlier, and it was as systematic as any military planning. The livestock that could not be fed through the cold months were slaughtered in the autumn. Not wasted, but processed. Salted, smoked, dried. The techniques of preservation that the Norse world used are well documented from both archaeological and textual sources, and they represent a genuine technological capability. Smoking meat or fish does not simply add flavor, it reduces water content to levels that inhibit bacterial growth, effectively extending the food's viable life from days to months. Salting draws moisture out through osmotic pressure and creates an environment hostile to the microorganisms that cause spoilage. Fermentation, which sounds counterintuitive as a preservation method, but is among the most reliable ones humans have ever developed, was used for dairy products like skyr, creating a high-protein food with a long shelf life and no requirement for refrigeration. Large quantities of fish cod, herring, salmon were dried to the point where they could be stored and transported without spoilage for months. Stockfish, as Dries cod was called, became one of the most important commodities in medieval northern Europe. It was also, incidentally, a nearly perfect camp ration, lightweight, extremely high in protein, requiring only rehydration before consumption. Grain was stored from the harvest. Root vegetables were cellared. The overall logistics of a well-run Norse farmstead entering winter looked less like a household stocking up against bad weather and more like a military quartermaster's operation. Inventory taken, quantities calculated against expected duration, storage conditions verified. And when a Viking army overwintered on foreign territory as the Great Army did at Torksey and Repton and a dozen other sites across England and the European continent, they brought this logistical system with them, supplemented by whatever they could acquire locally. The archaeological evidence from Torksey suggests a population including women and children, not just warriors, which means that the camp was not simply a military staging area, but a mobile community, self-contained, carrying its own survival systems far from home. The fourth component is movement. This is the piece of the system that most directly converted winter from a threat into an advantage. In the Norse world, winter did not stop movement. In important ways, it enabled it. Skis in Old Norse, skeith, are not a Viking invention. The practice of moving across snow on wooden runners has been documented in Scandinavia from at least 4,000 years ago, predating the Viking Age by millennia. But the Norse world integrated skiing into its regular practice in ways that went far beyond recreation. The Norse god Ulra, a deity associated with hunting and archery, was also celebrated as a master of skiing, which reflects how deeply the skill was embedded in the culture. When a warrior culture builds a god around a skill, that skill is not optional. The historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the early 13th century, describes Norse warriors using skis for military reconnaissance. This is retrospective evidence, and it should be stated clearly that we cannot confirm identical practice during the Viking Age itself, but the cultural continuity suggests the behavior was established. What skis provided, and what was genuinely decisive, was the ability to move fast and quietly across terrain that stopped everything else. A man walking through knee-deep snow moves slowly, exhausts himself, and announces his position with every footstep. A man on skis moves at a pace comparable to a slow jog on clear ground, uses far less energy, and makes very little sound. In the context of hunting, this was useful. In the context of military operations, it was potentially the difference between successfully scouting an enemy position and being spotted before you could report back. The bone skates found at sites across the Norse world, including the trading centre of Birka in Sweden and the Viking settlement at York in England, served a different but related purpose. Rivers and lakes in winter, once frozen solidly enough to bear weight, became flat, frictionless surfaces where movement was faster and easier than on any road. In an age when most travel was either on horseback along established routes or by boat on open water, a frozen waterway represented something that had no equivalent at any other time of year. Free infrastructure, requiring no construction, available to anyone who knew how to use it. But the deepest strategic advantage of ice and snow was not about how it helped the Vikings move, it was about how it stopped everyone else. The military systems of Viking Age Europe, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, Irish, were built around cavalry, supply wagons, and seasonal campaigning. Cavalry required solid ground. Supply wagons required passable roads. Both required weather conditions that allowed armies to operate without catastrophic attrition from the cold. When winter arrived, those systems effectively shut down. The war season ended. Armies dispersed or retreated behind their walls and waited. The Vikings did not wait. An army that could operate through winter, that could move across frozen rivers when no cavalry could follow, that could survive in the field when no supply wagon could reach them, that could maintain its cohesion and effectiveness through conditions that dissolved other armies, had an operational window that its enemies simply did not. The military advantage was not just tactical. It was architectural. It was built into the calendar in a way that no amount of bravery or numerical superiority could easily overcome. The fifth component is perhaps the hardest to quantify, but archaeologists and historians increasingly argue it was as important as any of the others. It is the community. The Norse winter was not spent in isolation. It was spent in concentrated, enforced proximity, entire extended families and sometimes entire villages locked together inside longhouses by weather that made casual outdoor activity inadvisable for months at a time. This sounds like misery, and sometimes it undoubtedly was. But it also created something that modern social scientists would recognize as a high-density community resilience network. The saga tradition, the practice of telling long, elaborate narrative stories of history, adventure, lore, genealogy, and theology around the winter fire was not entertainment in the way we use the word today. It was a knowledge transmission system. When a saga described how a great-grandfather survived a famine winter, or how a particular chieftain's tactical decision led to disaster, or how a feud between two families was resolved, it was encoding practical information about how to navigate the world in a form that was memorable, repeatable, and emotionally engaging enough to be retold generation after generation. The children building snow forts and assaulting each other's frozen redoubts were not wasting time. They were learning coordination, spatial reasoning, physical courage, group tactics, and the experience of being both attacker and defender skills that would translate directly into adult military life in a society that expected its men to be capable fighters. Olaus Magnus, writing in the 16th century, described these winter games in enough detail to make clear that they were organized, structured, and treated as meaningful preparation rather than idle play. And there was the assembly, the thing, in Old Norse. During winter, when travel was difficult and people were confined largely to their local areas, the thing brought members of a community together to adjudicate disputes, pass laws, and make collective decisions. This was not a luxury that warmer civilizations had generously extended to northern peoples. It was a practical response to the fact that winter forced people into the same space and gave them time to deal with the accumulated business of community life. The long-term consequence, a tradition of participatory governance that influenced the constitutional development of Iceland, Norway, and eventually, through a long and winding chain of influence, the parliamentary democracies of the modern world, began in the frozen darkness of a Norse winter. P. Hayes 1. The problem no one else could solve. There is a moment in 860 AD that the Frankish chronicles record with something close to helplessness. A Viking force has established itself on an island in the Seine River near the settlement of Oisel in what is now Normandy. They have dug in. They have made it clear they are not going anywhere. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, assembles a substantial force and moves to dislodge them. He brings cavalry. He brings siege equipment. He brings the most organized military apparatus in Western Europe at that time. He fails. The chronicles are frustratingly thin on the operational details. Sources from this period require careful handling, but the result is not in doubt. Charles cannot assault the island effectively. His cavalry cannot cross the river in a way that preserves its combat effectiveness. His supply lines, stretched thin through late autumn and into winter, begin to falter. He pays tribute and withdraws. This was not a unique failure. It was a structural one. And it repeated itself across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England, across the coastal regions of Ireland, across the Lower Rhine and the Loire Valley and the Tagus River estuary in Iberia. Everywhere that Viking forces chose to operate on the seasonal schedule they had developed rather than the one their enemies expected. To understand why the other military powers of Viking Age Europe could not solve the winter problem, you need to understand what winter actually did to the kind of army they had built. The armoured cavalryman, the heavy horseman who was the dominant military unit of Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe, was extraordinarily powerful in certain conditions. On firm, dry ground, with room to manoeuvre, a well-trained cavalry force could shatter infantry formations and decide battles in minutes. But that power was entirely conditional on the terrain and the weather. A horse, moving through deep snow, loses footing and exhausts itself rapidly. Ice, particularly the uneven, partially thawed and refrozen ice that characterizes river crossings in a European winter, was dangerous to horses in ways that made cavalry operations close to suicidal. The very ground that the Viking skater crossed effortlessly would kill a destrier. The logistics were equally punishing. A medieval army of any size required enormous quantities of food, both for its warriors and for its horses, which needed grain in winter when forage was unavailable. Moving that food through winter terrain required wagons, which required roads, which froze, flooded, or became impassable mud depending on the specific conditions. The supply chain that kept a Carolingian army functioning in summer became, in winter, a source of constant attrition that no amount of organizational skill could fully overcome. And then there was the psychological dimension. Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, and Irish warriors were not cowards. They were capable soldiers in the military systems they had trained for. But those systems assumed winter as a break, a reset period, a time to return home, to rest, to recover. When winter arrived and the fighting was supposed to stop, and then the fighting did not stop, the psychological impact on defenders was significant. It broke the expected rhythm of the year. It forced responses that had not been planned for, with resources that had not been reserved for winter operations, in conditions that degraded the effectiveness of everything they knew how to do. The Vikings had no such expectation of a break. They had been operating through winter conditions their entire lives. The cold was not a disruption to their system, it was part of their system. And the enemy's expectation that winter would bring relief was, in itself, a vulnerability. P. Hayes 2. The system deployed Torxi, 872 AD. The autumn of 872 AD. The great heathen army, the Mysil here of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the force that had landed in East Anglia 7 years earlier with the stated intention not of raiding but of conquest, has been working its way through the kingdoms of England. Northumbria has fallen. East Anglia has fallen. Mercia is under the kind of pressure that bends kingdoms. And now, as temperatures drop and the River Trent begins to thicken at its edges, the army makes a choice that its enemies do not understand until it is too late. It stops, not out of weakness, not from exhaustion. The army stops at Torksey, on the western bank of the Trent in Lincolnshire, and it sets up for the winter with a deliberateness that the archaeological record, 12 centuries later, makes unmistakably clear. The evidence from Torksey was first hinted at in the 1970s, but detailed analysis of the site published in the Antiquary's Journal and subsequently studied by archaeologists from the University of York and elsewhere has revealed a picture of extraordinary organizational sophistication. The camp extended across a large area of the riverbank. The artifacts recovered by metal detectorists over decades of searching include thousands of individual objects, silver coins and hack silver, the cut silver used as currency in the Viking economy from sources as distant as the Islamic world, copper alloy items, iron weapons and weapon fragments, gaming pieces of lead, and perhaps most evocatively, the clinch nails used in clinker-built ship construction. Someone was fixing ships at Torksey in the winter of 872 AD. Which means that whatever damage the campaign season had inflicted on the fleet, and a season of river navigation and coastal operations inflicted damage regularly, continuously, was being repaired, systematically, using materials that had been brought along for exactly this purpose. The fleet that left Torksey in the spring was not the fleet that arrived in the autumn, worn down by months of hard use. It was a maintained fleet, a ready fleet. But the ships are only the most visible part of what was happening. Consider the position. Torksey sits at the junction of the River Trent and the Foss Dyke, a canal connecting the Trent to the Witham and, through it, to Lincoln and the eastern lowlands. Whoever controlled Torksey in winter controlled the water highways of an enormous swath of the English Midlands. This was not a random choice of campsite. This was a strategic position selected by people who understood the geography and were prepared to hold it through conditions that would make any response difficult for their enemies. The presence of women and children, suggested by jewelry and domestic items among the finds, tells us something important about what kind of operation this was. The Great Army at Torksey was not simply a military force marking time between campaigns. It was a migrating community, organized along familiar Norse lines, running the same survival systems that worked at home in Scandinavia. The longhouse may have been replaced by tents or temporary structures. The evidence is not clear on this, but the essential elements were present: fire, food, community, and the skills to maintain all three through a northern winter. What did King Burgred of Mercia do? He came. He looked at what was on the river, and he made peace. The Chronicle's language is precise and uncomfortable. He paid tribute. He bought a winter without further hostilities by giving the army what it wanted, which meant that the army's strategy of wintering in place, of simply being there and being impossible to remove, had achieved a political result without requiring a single battle after the camps were established. This is the winter as weapon in its most direct form, not the cold as an ally in combat. The logistics, the survival system, the organizational capacity as a means of projecting power through a season when your enemies were structurally incapable of projecting any. The year after Torksey, the army moved to Repton, and from Repton it split, and the conquest of what would become the Danelaw, the northern and eastern portion of England under Norse rule, accelerated. The winter of 872 had made the spring of 873 possible. Phase 3. The system expands Iceland, Greenland, and the edge of the world. The year is 874 AD. A Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfr Arnason is sailing west. He is not the first Norse person to have seen Iceland. Earlier explorers, the details are preserved in sagas, with the usual caveats about saga reliability, had already made landfall and reported back on what was there. But Ingolfr is the first to bring a community, to set up a permanent settlement, to plant himself in the ground of a volcanic island at the edge of the habitable world and declare, "We are staying." The question that never gets asked often enough is, why could he do this when no one else could? Iceland is not an easy place. The winters are long and dark. The ground is partly volcanic, partly bog, partly covered in the kind of hardy scrub vegetation that takes centuries to establish and can be destroyed in a generation of overgrazing. The growing season is short. Timber is scarce. The birch forests that the first settlers found were largely cleared within a few centuries, partly for fuel, partly for construction, in a process of environmental degradation that the settlers seem not to have anticipated. But the Norse settlers stayed. They built their longhouses, turf-walled, low, heat-efficient, designed by people who had been building against the cold for centuries. They managed their livestock. They dried their fish. They set up their things. Within 50 years, Iceland had not just a settlement, but a civilization. Farms spread across the valleys, law codes being developed, literary culture beginning to take shape in the long winter evenings. The answer was not courage. It was not seamanship. It was the fact that Iceland in winter was, to a Norse settler, recognizable. The same problem, at a slightly more extreme setting. And they had already solved it. The excavated longhouse at Hrísbrú in the Mosfell Valley, one of the best preserved Viking Age sites in Iceland, dating to around 900 AD, shows the familiar construction: turf walls, central hearth, livestock stall integrated into the structure. The people who built it were not improvising. They were executing a design they knew. 11 years later, in 985 AD, a man named Eric the Red led a fleet of settlers further west, to an island even colder and more remote than Iceland. Eric had been exiled from Iceland for killing a man which, in the Norse world, was a legal matter before it was a moral one, and had used that exile to map the fjord systems on the southwestern coast of what he called Greenland. It was, by the standards of Nordic real estate marketing, an ambitious name. 25 ships left Iceland for Greenland. 14 arrived. The others were lost to storms, to ice, to the unforgiving North Atlantic in autumn. The 14 that arrived carried people who built longhouses with turf walls that were, in some cases, even thicker than anything they had constructed in Iceland. The Norse Greenland settlements, which survived for roughly 500 years before disappearing in circumstances that remain among the most compelling mysteries in medieval archaeology, used walls up to 2 meters thick at some sites. The thermal logic was the same as it had always been, pushed to its extreme. They survived. For a while. But the confirmation that the system had no upper limit on its ambition came in approximately 1000 AD, when a man named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed further west than any documented European had ever gone, and made landfall on the northeastern coast of what is now North America. The site at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated beginning in the 1960s by Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein, is the only confirmed Viking Age site in the Americas. What they found there should be read as a capsule summary of everything we have been discussing. A longhouse built from sod, in the Norse style. A forge for iron, the earliest evidence of European ironworking anywhere in the Americas, by current archaeological consensus. The remains of a boat repair facility. And a spindle hall. A spindle whirl, a small circular disc used to weight a spindle during wool spinning. Evidence that someone, almost certainly a woman, was practicing the textile tradition at the western edge of the world, in a place no European would officially reach again for nearly 5 centuries. The winter survival system had crossed the Atlantic. It did not make the Norse settlement of North America permanent. There were conflicts with the indigenous peoples of the region, the sagas call them Skraelings, that the small Norse force could not sustain indefinitely without larger reinforcement. The settlement at Lens or Meadows was eventually abandoned, probably after only a few years. But the point is not that the Norse conquered North America. The point is that they got there. At a time when no other European maritime culture had the systems to survive the journey the North Atlantic, even in the relatively mild periods of the medieval warm period, he was not a forgiving place in winter. The Norse could make the crossing, because they had spent centuries building the tools to handle what they found. The system did not just allow the Viking Age to happen. The Viking Age was, in a fundamental sense, the system operating at full capacity. Pays 4. The cost. When the system reached its limits, nothing is free. Every piece of the winter survival machine that we have described, the insulated houses, the preserved food, the layered clothing, the skis and skates, the community practices, the long organizational traditions required something in return. And the places where the system failed, or where its demands exceeded what people could pay, reveal the true price of what was being sustained. Start with the campaign itself. The year after Torksey, the Great Army moved to Repton, in Derbyshire, where it spent the winter of 873 to 874. The archaeological work at Repton, conducted over many decades by Martin Biddle and Bertha Kulby Biddle, among others, produced evidence that complicates the triumphant narrative. There was a mass grave at Repton, a charnel deposit containing the remains of 264 to 269 individuals. Analysis continues to refine the count, many of them showing evidence of trauma consistent with violent death. Alongside them, items associated with Norse identity: Thor's hammer pendants, weapons, evidence of grave goods. These were Viking dead. People who had travelled from Scandinavia to England, who had survived the crossing and the campaign and the siege of Repton, who had perhaps been part of the disciplined overwintering system that worked so well at Torksey, and who had died anyway. Some from combat, some, the skeletal evidence suggests, from disease. Osteological analysis has found signs consistent with malnutrition in some individuals. An army living through a northern winter in the field, even a well-organized one, even one with the Norse survival system operating as designed, faced continuous attrition from illness. Dysentery, respiratory infections, and other contagious diseases spread efficiently in the close quarters of a winter camp. The lack of dietary variety, preserved fish and smoked meat, are excellent calories, but limited in the micronutrients that prevent conditions like scurvy, took a toll over months. The cold itself, combined with physical exertion and inadequate rest, wore down immune systems in ways that ancient warriors had no framework to understand and no means to address. The system worked, but it worked at a cost. And then there is Greenland. The Norse settlement of Greenland lasted from approximately 985 AD until sometime in the early 15th century, roughly 450 years, which is, by any measure, an extraordinary run for a colony at the edge of the habitable world. At its height, it comprised perhaps 500 farms and several thousand people. It had churches. It sent tribute to the Norwegian crown. It participated in the long-distance trade that connected the North Atlantic rim. And then it stopped. The details of the collapse of Norse Greenland are still actively debated by historians and climate scientists, and it would be dishonest to present a single, clean explanation. What seems clear from the combined evidence, archaeological, paleoclimatic documentary, is that multiple pressures converged. The Little Ice Age, beginning in the late 13th century and intensifying through the 14th, made the climate of Greenland significantly colder than it had been during the period of settlement. The sea ice that the Norse had navigated using their established knowledge of North Atlantic conditions became more extensive and less predictable. Trade connections with Norway, already irregular, became unreliable. The system that had sustained the settlements through 5 centuries of harsh conditions was designed for a certain range of inputs. When the climate shifted beyond that range, the system could not adapt quickly enough. The last confirmed contact with the Greenland settlements was in 1408 AD. After that, silence, bones, empty buildings, objects preserved under permafrost, waiting to be found by archaeologists, working against a new deadline imposed by a different kind of climate change. The most poignant artifact is perhaps the clothing found at Herjolfsnes garments, buried with the dead, at a Greenlandic farm site, dated by their style to the early 15th century. The clothing is European in fashion, following styles current in the continental Europe of the period, which means that even at the end, the Norse Greenlanders were still connecting themselves to the wider world they came from. They were not savages retreating into barbarism under pressure. They were people trying to maintain who they were in a place that was becoming uninhabitable. We do not know exactly how the Norse Greenland settlement ended. The records were kept elsewhere, and they are thin. What we know is that an entire Norse civilization, historians estimate somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people at the settlement's end, vanished from the historical record without leaving an account of what happened to them. The system had its limits. And then there is the most invisible cost of all: the people who were not in the army. Every man who spent a winter at Torksey was not spending that winter at home. Every craftsman fixing ships on the frozen Trent was not managing his own farm, his own animals, his own children. Every warrior sharpening iron in a foreign country had left behind people who were operating the survival system without him. The woman weaving against the winter deadline, managing the stored food, teaching the children, making decisions that would have been made collectively if he were there. The winter survival system of the Norse world was not built on the strength of warriors alone. It was built on a distribution of labor that placed enormous demands on every member of the community, demands that did not diminish when half the able-bodied men were in England or Ireland or Normandy. It was sustained by people whose names are not in the sagas, whose contributions do not appear in the chronicles, whose graves, when we find them, contain spindle whorls and weaving tools rather than swords. The machine worked. It crossed oceans. It held kingdoms hostage. It planted communities in the coldest places in the world. But it was never free. Five. The night in January, when the system changed everything. January 878 AD. Chippenham, Wiltshire. This is the moment when the Viking winter system delivered its most consequential result, not through a campaign of months, but through a single operation timed with what could only have been deliberate precision. The context requires a brief reconstruction. Alfred, King of Wessex, is the last Anglo-Saxon king still resisting the Great Army. Every other major kingdom, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, has fallen to the Norse advance. Wessex is the final piece. Guthrum, the Danish leader who has inherited command of the principal Viking force in England, is preparing for the decisive move. He chooses January. And that choice is not incidental. January in central England means frozen ground, ground that gave Guthrum's infantry solid footing to cover distance in days that would have taken weeks through autumn mud. It meant roads that could not be churned into impassable ruts by an army on the march. It meant rivers that Anglo-Saxon forces could not use to flank or pursue. The very landscape that was supposed to protect Alfred, the rivers, the marshes, the difficult terrain of midwinter Wessex, had hardened into a surface that worked in Guthrum's favour. The cold that was meant to stop an army was the road he used to reach the king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the attack in its characteristic plain language. The Danish host rode across Mercia into Wessex, seized Chippenham, drove a great part of the people across the sea, and conquered most of the others. Alfred himself escaped with a small retinue to the marshes of Somerset. This is, by any measure, close to the most complete military reversal in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. And it was accomplished not through superior numbers. Guthrum's force at this point was probably not significantly larger than what Wessex could field, but through timing. January. The Anglo-Saxon military system depended on the fyrd, the mobilization of free men who owed military service to the king. This system could be activated quickly in summer, when men were available, roads were passable, and the logistical infrastructure of a settled agricultural society could support it. In January, with the harvest long consumed, the roads frozen or flooded, and men committed to the survival logistics of their own farms and families, the fyrd could not be assembled with anything like its normal speed. Alfred was caught in his hall before his army could cohere around him. He fled into the marshes, into a phase of his life that English historical tradition has turned into a kind of national founding myth. Alfred hiding in a peasant woman's cottage, Alfred rallying his people from nothing, Alfred, the king, who refused to accept defeat. What the myth rarely emphasizes is what Guthrum was doing during those same months. He was operating in January, in Wessex, moving, consolidating, establishing his grip on the kingdom's administrative centre while the king was in hiding, and the English defence system was paralysed by a combination of shock and the wrong season. The Viking winter system had not merely helped an army survive, it had created an operational window, a period of roughly 3 to 4 months in which the Norse force could act and the English force structurally could not. And it had used that window to execute a near-complete conquest of the last resistant kingdom in England. It did not quite work. Alfred survived the winter in the Somerset levels. He regrouped. By May 878, he had assembled enough force to meet Guthrum at the Battle of Edington, and he won. He forced a peace that required Guthrum's baptism as a Christian, and the formal partition of England into Danish-controlled and Anglo-Saxon-controlled zones. But the aftermath of that near conquest, the result of Alfred's desperate winter scramble to find a response, is where the Viking winter system's deepest legacy becomes visible. Alfred built burhs. He built them systematically, based on a document known as the Burgel Hidage that lists 30-odd fortified places distributed across Wessex, and later the rest of the territory his successors would recover. These were not simply walls. They were an administrative and logistical network, a system for mobilizing defense, garrisoning prepared positions, and ensuring that no part of Wessex was more than a day's march from a fortified refuge. They were, in essence, a direct answer to the structural problem that Guthrum had exploited: the vulnerability of an unfortified, uncoordinated defense against a force that could operate in winter. England did not become a unified country despite the Viking Age. It became a unified country partly because of it. The pressure of sustained Norse operations, including and especially the winter operations that no previous threat had imposed, forced Alfred and his successors to build the administrative, military, and infrastructural foundations of a national state. The Viking winter system had not just defeated armies, it had created the conditions that forced its enemies to evolve. The ice breaks up in the spring. It does not happen all at once. It happens in stages, the river groaning under its own weight, cracks spreading from the banks, sheets of ice beginning to ride up over each other in the current, the whole frozen surface slowly coming apart in the manner of something that has been holding together under enormous pressure and has finally run out of reasons to continue. At Torksey, in the spring of 873, the ships went back into the water. The clinch nails had been replaced. The hulls had been caulked. The crews had spent the winter maintaining their equipment with the same systematic attention that they brought to everything else in the survival system. The fleet that launched into the Trent that spring was ready. The army marched south to Repton. Toward the next chapter of the conquest, what they left behind at Torksey was not nothing. The villages of Lincolnshire that winter had been adjacent to an army of occupation. The logistical demands of wintering thousands of warriors, even warriors with their own food stores, their own organizational systems, their own internal economy of hack silver and traded goods, placed real burdens on the surrounding population. Livestock went missing. Grain stocks were drawn down. People who could not run fast enough were taken. Slavery was a significant component of the Viking economy, a fact that is often softened in popular accounts but must be stated directly for the history to be honest. The winter system that made the Norse army so effective in its own terms was sustained, in part, by the communities it overran. The warmth inside the Norse camp was connected, directly and uncomfortably, to the cold that others experienced outside it. This is not a simple accounting. It is a reminder that systems which appear coherent and even admirable from the inside can look very different from the outside. The longhouse that kept a Norse family alive was also the economic unit from which the army was supplied. The preserved food that sustained the camp at Torksey was, in part, food that had been removed from someone else's stores. The organizational efficiency of the winter machine did not eliminate the cost of its operation. It concentrated that cost and redirected it. What the chronicles cannot give us, the ground has. The historical sources on Viking casualties are, to put it charitably, unreliable. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and its contemporary equivalents were not written as military histories in any modern sense. They were records kept by religious establishments that had every reason to emphasize Norse savagery and every reason to be vague about details that might embarrass English. Kings. The saga literature, compiled centuries after the events it describes, carries the distortions of oral transmission and political purpose. What we have at certain sites is bone. Repton's mass burial, 264 to 269 individuals, most showing evidence of Norse identity, many showing trauma, is the most direct physical evidence we have of what war and winter together cost the army. The precise circumstances of those deaths remain debated. Were they warriors killed in a single engagement, accumulated dead from the campaign and the winter both? The osteological evidence suggests a range of causes. What is not debated is that they were real people, with names that were forgotten when they were placed in the earth, in a foreign country, far from the fjords and farms they came from. The individual stories are gone, the bones remain. And the bones tell us something that the chronicles do not. Dying was not only something that happened to the enemy, the winter machine demanded its operators too. Then there is the matter of those who never came back to the homes they left. The craftsman at the Torksey camp, the man whose work is evidenced by those clinch nails, may have been part of the army that moved to Repton and then split, with part continuing the conquest of England and part turning toward the Scandinavian world. We do not know. He might be among the Repton dead. He might have eventually returned to a farm in Denmark and died old. He might have settled in the Danelaw and become one of the Norse settlers whose descendants would be absorbed into the English population over the generations that followed. The woman whose weaving work kept the people in the camp clothed through that winter was doing it somewhere Norway, Denmark, Iceland, without the man she had sent. For the duration of the campaign season, and then the duration of the winter, and then another campaign season. Managing the farm, managing the animals, managing the children, making every decision that needed to be made, without confirmation that any of it was helping someone who was still alive. This was the unreported casualty of the Viking Age. The people at home, doing the work, not knowing. If you go to Torksey today, you will find a village in Lincolnshire, a few hundred people. The River Trent still runs past it. Though it no longer freezes reliably in winter, the climate has shifted enough that the deep winter freezes of the 8th and 9th centuries, when Norse armies ran their operations on the ice, have become uncommon. The fields around the village have been cultivated for more than a millennium. The evidence of the Viking camp is below the surface, emerging in fragments through metal detection and careful excavation. Somewhere under those fields, a clinch nail from a ship repaired in the winter of 872 may still be waiting. The Repton site can be visited. There is a church there, the church that the Viking army converted to use as part of its fortified enclosure, a continuity of use that says something about how history layers itself in places like this. The mass burial was reinterred after excavation. There is nothing to mark the spot for the casual visitor. The dead of that winter lie as anonymously, now as they always did. The emptiness of the battlefield of every battlefield, in the aftermath, is its own kind of testimony. The flags come down, the fires go out, the ice breaks up. What is left is the record of what was decided there, and the bones of the people for whom the decision was made at the cost of their lives. History remembers the kingdoms that fell, and the kings who fled. It does not often remember the 264 people in that pit at Repton, but they were there, in a foreign country, in winter, far from wherever home had been. The larger story was built from people exactly like them, people whose names the chronicles never recorded, and whose bones the earth kept for 12 centuries until someone thought to look. We started on a frozen river, an army waiting for spring that was not going home, that was not retreating, that was not spending the dark months in passivity, but was instead maintaining itself, sharpening itself, loading itself with exactly the capabilities it would need when the ice broke and the campaign resumed. That image is the key to everything that followed. The question we asked at the beginning was not, how did the Vikings survive winter? The question was, why did winter make them stronger? Now we can answer it properly. They were stronger in winter because they had built, over centuries, a system that treated winter not as an interruption of life, but as a different mode of it. A mode with its own demands, its own opportunities, its own tactical advantages, its own form of preparation. Every component of that system, the longhouse, the textile tradition, the food preservation, the movement skills, the community practices, was the accumulated answer to the same question, asked over and over across generations. What is the specific thing that will kill us here, and how do we make sure it does not? The answer to that question, scaled up over centuries and applied with the organizational coherence of a culture that transmitted knowledge through story and practice rather than text, became something more than survival technology. It became a competitive advantage of the highest order, an advantage that was not easily copied because it was not a single innovation. It was a system interlocking, mutually reinforcing, deeply embedded in daily life that took generations to build and could not be acquired simply by adopting one element of it. When the Frankish armies found themselves unable to dislodge the Viking forces from their winter positions, it was not because they lacked courage or numbers or good generalship. It was because they were operating with a different set of foundational tools. The winter survival system was the moat that no cavalry could cross. The strategic consequences of that asymmetry extended across the map of the medieval world. North America had been reached by Europeans by the year 1000 AD, not by the southern Mediterranean civilizations with their sophisticated navies and long maritime traditions, not by the Arabs, who were in many respects the most technologically advanced civilization of the period, by people from a place where the sun disappeared for weeks at a time, who had learned to read the ice and navigate by it, who carried with them a longhouse and a spindle and the knowledge of how to make everything work when the cold came down. The spindle whirl at Lens aux Meadows is, in its quiet way, one of the most remarkable objects in the history of Western exploration. It says, "We brought the whole system. We did not come to raid and return. We came prepared to live here." The fact that it did not last does not diminish what it represents. It was the furthest western point the winter survival system ever reached. England was reshaped by the encounter with that system in ways that persisted long after the Viking Age ended. Alfred's burhs became the foundation of the English administrative state. The towns that grew from those fortified positions became the market centres of medieval England. The legal and political reforms that Alfred undertook, partly in direct response to the pressure of sustained Norse operations, gave England a more sophisticated administrative apparatus than it would otherwise have developed in the same time frame. The parliamentary traditions that eventually emerged from English governance trace part of their ancestry to Alfred's response to a threat that came alive in winter. Iceland, founded by the Norse settlers of the 9th century, developed a governmental tradition, the Althing, established in 930 AD, one of the oldest parliamentary assemblies in the world that was incubated in part by the long winter evenings when communities gathered in longhouses and worked out how to govern themselves. The Thing, the Norse assembly, was a winter institution. Democracy in Northern Europe was, in a meaningful sense, a winter product. And then there is Greenland, which closes the story as honestly as any ending can. The settlements are gone. The turf walls have settled back into the ground. The permafrost that preserved clothing and organic material for 5 centuries is now, in some areas, beginning to melt. Different climate, different threat, different kind of winter coming. Archaeologists are working against a new deadline, documenting what was preserved before a new wave of change destroys it. The Norse settlers of Greenland built a civilization in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, and maintained it for 4.5 centuries before conditions shifted beyond the range their system was designed to handle. That is not a failure. 4.5 centuries is longer than the United States has existed. It is longer than the Roman Empire in the West lasted, from Augustus to the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. It is, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinary run. It ended. All things end. But it ran for 4.5 centuries on the same technology that had been developed in the fjords and longhouses of the Norse homeland. The thermal wall, the preserved food, the layered wool, the frozen river as highway. Those things were enough. For a long time, they were more than enough. If you go to Lincolnshire today and stand near the village of Torksey, the River Trent will be running past you, as it has for longer than anyone can remember. In a mild winter, you will not see ice on it. The climate that made those winters so cold, so long, so defining the climate that created the pressures that built the system that sent longships to Newfoundland, has shifted. The river that was a military highway in 872 AD is now simply a river. But the fields around it still hold their secrets. The clinch nails are still down there somewhere, the gaming pieces, the hacksilver, the 10,000 small fragments of a winter that history recorded in its outline and the earth preserved in its details. The people who stood on that ice were not mythological figures. They were not the horned helmet caricatures of later imagination. They were men and women and children who had inherited a way of engaging with the world's hardness, a way that had been worked out, refined, corrected, and passed on over many generations, and who carried it with them to places that had never seen anything like it before. The cold that was supposed to stop them is what allowed them to go. The ice they were supposed to fear is what they walked on. The winter that was meant to end the campaign season is what made the next one possible. That is the story of the Viking winter. Not a story of magic or myth or the special ferocity of northern people. A story of a system built by ordinary human ingenuity, applied consistently over a long time, that turned the most reliable enemy any army had ever faced, the cold, into an ally. And the world that came after was different because of it, in ways we still live in today.